Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 71. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, and we were doing all right. As the NBA playoffs continue, our Thursday pod, we went 3-2 against the spread. We're still at 25-17 against the spread in the NBA playoffs / play-in, and we're rolling with 37 wins, 21 losses, and a push against the spread since we've been doing NBA picks on this pod. We'll continue with some more NBA picks is what we continue to do each and every time we do the pod twice a week. We'll hit you with whatever the next games are in the NBA. We'll bless you with a pick there and more. So stay tuned for that. But first, hey Iowa, DRF Sportsbook is sending all parlays to the moon. Start cashing in with DRF Sportsbook's 22% profit boost for all MLB, NBA, or NHL parlays. The MLB season is here, and along with the NBA playoffs and the NHL Stanley Cup playoffs, so it's time to celebrate, and we want to boost your profits. So head over to the DRF Sportsbook now and start betting. Must be physically present in Iowa to wager. So coming up, as mentioned, we will get you caught up with all the latest in the NBA action. We'll actually touch on a little bit of the NBA draft, but more so, it's all NBA all the time as we're in the thick of the NBA playoffs as we're into the second round now. And to do that, we got our guy, Mr. Matt Russell, stopping by to join us, and that starts right about now. And welcome once again to the DRF Sports Podcast. As always, joined by my dude, Mr. Matt Russell. Obviously, the NBA playoffs are going on, but there's something else. How you feeling coming off, a little NFL talk in springtime? A little draft talk, maybe? How you feeling?
Yeah, I got deep into the weeds there, man. I watched way more of the 4th through 7 rounds than I ever thought possible because there wasn't anything on Saturday. How did we get to a point in the late April, right? Like one of the great sports months on the calendar. How did we get to a point where there was actually nothing going on from a playoff standpoint in April? But the draft was a success. We ended up hitting pretty well on those early top picks. Didn't get any of our long shots that we were hoping for, which really would have made it a nice little draft experience. But it's funny because we talked about on the show on Thursday how it's really tricky to do one single NFL draft podcast, right? Do you do it 2 weeks ago? Do you do it a month ago? Do you do it the day of or a couple of days before the draft? Because everything is sort of moving along. And it's this one event where you're just sort of picking off bets over the course of 2 months, maybe even longer than that. And so it's just kind of impossible. But then I go and I look at some of the stuff that, people respond to me as far as the stuff that I wrote over at the Score. And even after the move where Trayvon Walker becomes the favorite, at first it was a move to about minus 200, somewhere along those lines, and Aiden Hutchinson to plus 250. People were still like, no, take Aiden Hutchinson. And it's like, okay, sometimes you just have to save people from themselves. And so hopefully maybe that podcast being able to just talk about that the day of the draft just stopped people from, if it saved one person, it was worth it. Hopefully it stopped one person from looking and going, oh, Hayden Hutchinson, he's been on all the mock drafts. He's plus 300. He's plus 400 to go number one. What great value, right? Like that's the point. We have to read the market. We have to see what's happening out there and know that when it comes to the NFL draft, a move like that means death for the chances of the number one overall pick to be Aiden Hutchinson. How close was Ike Ekwonu ever to being the first overall pick? And Doug Peterson winning that battle in the draft room, we will never know. And of course, by the way, doesn't really matter whether we think Trayvon Walker is any good, right? All of those picks have nothing to do with whether we think the player is good, whether the player is a fit, right? All of it has to do with sort of logic, common sense, and whether a draft room and a franchise has logic and has common sense, right? And so some do, some don't, and we'll have to see when it comes to Trayvon Walker whether that pans out for the Jacksonville Jaguars.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you mentioned that there wasn't a lot going on Saturday, and the real reason for that is just because there were a lot of closeout games in the
Yeah.
NBA that happened since the last time we talked. And if you tune into the pod, what we've been doing during the playoffs and towards the end of the NBA season, we come on here, try to give you guys some picks and try to keep track of what's going on during the playoffs. And last Thursday's pod, a 3-2 pod against the spread, bringing the overall play-in/playoffs record to 25-17, 25 and 17 in English, and then 37-21-1 against spread overall in the NBA pick since we've been doing this on the pod post Soup or Bowl. Last week's picks, as mentioned, did okay, but we start in the West. There are a trio of closeout games, all closed out on the road. We have the Suns, who won and covered 115-109. They won that series 3-2. Devin Booker played, which obviously would have put a wrench into some of the point spreads there. He had 13 points. Chris Paul with the point god type performance, going 14 for 14 from the floor, 33 points, 8 assists, 5 rebounds, lots of tears. There's like crying and all that going on post game with Willie Green and all that. Emotional scenes there.
Yeah.
Zion, not emotional at all. Still not playing. Anyways, story for another day. Suns win and move on to play the Mavs. And the Mavs, who won and covered their Game 6 closeout game in Utah, they win at 3-2. Bogdanovich had a 3 at the end to win the game, and he missed. And now it's probably the end of Utah as we know it. Mavs and Suns, Game 1, set to tip Monday night. Suns favored by 5.5 points for Game 1. I'm going to say this, Matt. I'm going to go with the Suns here. I think it's a bad matchup for the Mavs, and the playoffs, as we know, comes all the way down to matchups. I think a lot of the open threes that the Mavs were able to concoct against the Utah Jazz, they will not be able to get against a better, more agile defensive team like the Phoenix Suns. The matchups for Luka, whether it's Jay Crowder, whether it's Bridges, whether it's Cam Johnson off the bench, like they got a lot of long athletic wings to throw at Luka. And the Mavs, I don't know if they're used to yet, they can meld the playing styles of how well they did without Luka, with like Jalen Brunson playing point guard and all that fun stuff, and then just Luka being Luka. Can they meld those two things? They struggled to do that against Utah. It got dicey against Utah, and we know Utah isn't good. The Suns, I feel like the Suns are pretty good. And I mean, if you're telling me Booker's there, I'm not expecting him to be a hundo P, but he's there. So, yeah, Game 1, I'm interested to see how it plays out for sure, but give me the 5.5 points for the Suns. And overall, give me the Suns in 6 in this series.
Okay, yeah, I'm kind of with you here, man. Like this Suns team, yeah, obviously when Devin Booker goes out, like it gets a little bit sketchy, and then he comes back, and you mentioned the point spread sort of flipping around there. They end up closing 3.5, I think, 3.5 point favorites in that game. That was the one game of those trio of Game 6s I thought that the home team was going to actually force that Game 7. Of course, didn't know that Booker would play, and actually had a couple of key baskets there in that game. And so as he comes back, it's funny, the scheduling, right? Because these closeout games all by and large happen on Thursday, with the one exception being Friday, and Memphis closing out Minnesota in Minnesota. And then of course they had to turn around and go back home and play the Warriors yesterday, which is obviously a game and series that we're going to get to here. But Phoenix, meanwhile, has gotten a couple extra days here, especially relative to the Memphis Grizzlies, right? Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then obviously a full day here coming up today. And you go, okay, like that's only going to help Devin Booker, who's, by the way, like his injury was only like a week-long type of a thing, right? So he gets injured and then has, needs a week to, get back in it. So how bad could it have possibly been, right? And so if it only takes a week or so to get healthy, getting 4 more days, right? That's almost, it's half of a week. So I feel like he is going to be really healthy and ready to go for this series. Now, again, could that pop up at any given time? Yeah, but you know what? A lot of people's hamstrings could pop up at any given time, right? Especially when it comes to the NBA playoffs so far. So I look at this and I go, I laugh when you're talking about like, the Dallas, they beat the Jazz, because it's, you feel really good about Dallas sort of in theory, right? Where it's like, yeah, we didn't think anything of them, most of us, I suppose, even though, again, I'm still kicking myself for not just planting my flag on the Mavericks. And then they beat the Jazz in part without Luka, and then Luka comes back and he looks awesome. And you go like, oh yeah, this Dallas team, like they might be a contender, but you're right. Like it has to come back to the idea that like it was just the Jazz who were just throwing each other under the bus hand over fist. And right, everybody's just decided like Donovan Mitchell's got to go. And Rudy Gobert is like threatening to not block shots because his team is so bad on ball defense. It's like, if you guys are going to let guys go by, I'm just going to let them get buckets because I don't feel, as a matter of protest out there. And so like, okay, like I can't. And by the way, like these games are really close that the Mavericks won, right? Especially when Luka came back. Obviously, the one blowout game back in Dallas, but the road games in Utah. And so I just go like, I realize the regular season in a lot of cases like doesn't mean all that much, but the regular season has to mean something as far as like continuity and chemistry and all of that stuff. That, by the way, the Suns team went to the finals last year, right? This isn't just a 1 year type deal. But the point is like, this is not the Jazz, like not willing to talk to each other, not willing to have any communication on or off the court. And so I look at this and I go like, Phoenix -5.5, like at home, like that does feel kind of short, right? Like this feels like one that probably should be closer to 7.5. And who knows by game time, whether that'll be the case, right? And like, I just don't see the Mavericks as a contender all of a sudden, right? There was a pretty obvious dividing line when the playoffs started between the Suns, Mavs, Memphis Grizzlies and Warriors, and then the Mavs, and then just obviously kind of everybody else below that. I mean, there wasn't really anything in the sleeper department when it came to the West. And so I'm looking at this right now as maybe not betting this series price, because the series price -290, like that's a pretty healthy price for going against a team that, by the way, might have the best player in the series, right? Depending on how impactful Luka Doncic actually is, which I imagine is going to be considerable. I'm looking at this as more of a long-term thing. I think this is a little bit of a hiccup that the Suns had against the Pelicans isn't indicative of their long-term chances. And what's happened in the marketplace is that the Suns have actually gone up and lengthened in price to win the title. They came into this playoffs in the +200s, right? Between +250 and +290. They're +350 right now. And they've already gotten rid of one of the steps, right? Like we talked about how there's like, when we get into the first round, there's a non-zero chance of them losing. Well, they got a little bit of a scare there in games, in a 6-game series, and their price actually went up. And I'm like, okay, like it has to come down. There are less teams. By the way, if you look around at some of the competition league-wide for the title, you've got a compromised Miami Heat team. You've got a compromised Sixers team, who's a big-time underdog in their second round. The Nets that were taking up all of this win probability, right? We talked about all season long about how absurd it was, what their odds were. That was taking a large piece of the pie when it comes to futures title win probability. That's disappeared. Where has that gone, right? Who has that gone to? Now, of course, we'll talk about Milwaukee, and that's obvious. Like they're clearly a contender. The Warriors, sure. But like, why has there some of that slice of the pie, if you will, been cut down from the Suns? That doesn't make much sense to me. So I think right now, this is a really good spot to sort of buy low in as weird as that is to say, on the Suns -5.5 tonight, but certainly grab some futures here on the Suns to win the title at +350, unless the Mavs knock them off in one of these two games, which, by the way, certainly possible. It's not going to get any better, right? It's not going to get any better than +350. But honestly, I would have told you it's not going to get any better than +300 before the playoffs started, and it has. So a little bit surprising there, but I think this is time to get in on the on the Suns, knowing that they're a pretty good matchup for the Warriors in the next round, if that ends up being the case. And certainly a good matchup, I think, against the Memphis Grizzlies in the next round. So, yeah, the big hurdle, I shouldn't say the big hurdle, but like the big scare, if you will, I think has already happened when it comes to a value standpoint. I think the Suns +350 to win the title. Now is the time to get in on that, because I think by the time we get to the championship and they're in the finals, maybe as the favorite, +350 is going to be looking awfully nice.
No, for sure. I totally get where you're coming from there. And the other series in the West, we got the Golden State Warriors versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Game 1 was on Sunday. Warriors won by 1 point, 117-116. John Moran missing at the buzzer, a scoop layup there, but it was a fun game. We're expecting a fun series ahead. Game 2 goes Tuesday. Golden State is favored by 2. And with it being such a short number, I'm going to be on the Warriors. I just think Memphis overall, like if I look at this series, I just don't think Memphis, I know them going down 0-2 at home is like a massive, massive thing. But I also feel like that is a thing that a young team that's not really ready for prime time would do. Like Draymond, I know Draymond isn't he's not Steph Curry, but he's a very important part of that team. And he got ejected with a lot of time left in that game. And the Warriors just kept on moving. You got Jordan Poole coming off the bench and cooking like that. I just don't know if Memphis is ready to deal and handle. And there's I didn't like that play call at the end. I don't know. I just think Memphis isn't ready yet for this. So give me the Warriors in game 2 at -2. And I was tempted to say Warriors in 5 in this series, but I'm going to say Warriors in 6. It's just a tough. Memphis just isn't there yet.
Yeah. So I guess that my question would be sort of how do you get to even 6 games, right? If they lose these first 2 games at home. And so to me, I would think that if you think they're going to lose this game, which, at -2 needing to cover is the only option, then you're kind of looking at a sweep here, I think.
So I think the real reason why I'm saying Memphis in 6, Warriors in 6, it's just a hedge. It's just a hedge on if they lose in this game tonight. That's all.
Yeah, just the verbal hedge. Okay, so I was on Memphis in this game, and it's always funny when you're on Memphis or on a team that at like a very, very tiny point spread, right? Like +2, in this case, +2.5. Was available yesterday. And so I hopped on that and you're watching the whole game. And like when you're betting a +2, especially in the NBA, you basically need the team to win outright, right? Like, yes, you have that sort of backdoor plan, so to speak, or not backdoor plan, but backup plan. You have this backup plan that, okay, well, maybe if it's a, super, super close game, like we get away with one. And that's kind of what happened. But the funny thing is, like, I won the bet, but because you're in this mindset for 2 hours of needing in your mind Memphis to win the game outright, there's this just weird feeling. And I had no ties to Memphis as far as like anything beyond, like I didn't bet the series and, futures, anything along those lines, right? So I should have just been absolutely gleeful by the fact that they covered the spread. And if the spread was 6.5 or 10.5 or something where I had little or very, much littler expectation of them actually winning outright, I wouldn't have felt the way that I did. But I was really bummed when Morant missed that layup. And, you mentioned the play call, and it's like, okay, like there's worse plays to have, especially we see guys drawing up plays. Joel Embiid, like fade away 3-pointers from Doc Rivers at the bell, like that sort of thing, where you go, yeah, you know what? A scoop layup for John Morant, like, isn't the worst thing. And it's probably the best option that team has, especially down 1, right? Where they don't necessarily need a 3. It's interesting. So Draymond gets kicked out, and that's a massive deal if it's against the Nuggets, right? Like massive, 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 because who's going to guard Nikola Jokic? Against the Grizzlies, Draymond has to be the guy that's sort of guarding everyone, right? We see, back in the heyday of Draymond, the clips of him guarding like 3 guys on one possession where he's just running around like a crazy person. There isn't that matchup on Memphis where it's like, oh, he definitely has to like lock down this guy for them to have a chance to win the game, right? Like maybe Jaren Jackson Jr., that guy was flinging in 3-pointers in the third quarter to get Memphis basically back into that game. So it's, when Draymond goes out, on the one hand, it's not the biggest deal when he goes out of that game, right? It doesn't mean curtains for the Warriors' chances of winning that game. Whereas like if he just missed a game against the Nuggets and Jokic could just go ham against the Kayvon Looneys of the world, then you're like, oh, okay, that's problematic. But on the flip side, I think a lot of people are going to come in here and be like, well, Draymond is not going to get kicked out of this game. They're going to have him for a full, 48 minutes or however many minutes, 36 to 40 minutes that Draymond's actually going to play. And yet the line, again, as of right now, right, -2, the line hasn't changed from the previous game, right? Like logically or whatever, you would think, okay, Draymond's going to play a lot more, so everybody's going to pile in on the Warriors. And maybe they do. Maybe they do pile in on the Warriors here and it moves the line, or maybe the line just doesn't move because sportsbooks are completely fine with people piling in on the Warriors. I just look at this and I go, okay, yeah, like I don't think the Grizzlies are going to win this series. Steph Curry, it's funny, like he mentioned the idea of like championship DNA after the game, but he also mentioned the idea of like getting greedy and winning 2 games in Memphis. And when you're talking to me all after the game already, like about getting greedy, it tells me that like your job was just to get one of the 2 games in Memphis. And they did catch Memphis on just an absolutely brutal travel situation. And as much as Memphis had some issues with the Timberwolves in that first round, you and I talked about the shot quality numbers, right? 90% of at least 4 out of the 6 games, they had a 90% win probability based on the shot quality. So they were playing better basketball than they actually, we say, oh, well, the Timberwolves could have won that series because of how close and they blew that one lead. But like also Memphis could have won that series really, really easily if they had just made some shots. So yeah, it's going to require some shot making at some point here, right? Desmond Bane, I didn't find he was too impactful in that game yesterday. And so I just look at it and I go, this is either a sweep or Memphis at least makes this a relatively interesting series. And just because the Warriors won without Draymond, which is something, again, they can do in a short period of time, basically a half of basketball in a series where he doesn't have that monster impact as far as dealing with the other team's best player, because it's the perimeter defense that is the issue for the Warriors because of Ja Morant being the key focus for the Memphis Grizzlies. I like Memphis in this one. I think they're going to win this game. I don't think they're going to win the series necessarily, but like just to essentially avoid a sweep potentially, I think they got to get this game. I think they do. So I'm going to be back on Memphis for a second time here in game 2. So a little bit of a mano-a-mano situation for me and you come game 2.
We'll get back to the pod in a sec, but first, be a pro and win. Introducing DRF Sports' all-new premium data feature on drf.com/sports. For $99 a year, which is just $8.25 a month, you can get industry-leading betting trends, angles, and analytics. With so many big sporting events here, it's the best way for you to make some money this postseason and have fun while doing it. That's DRF Sports Pro. Sign up now at drf.com/sports. Good stuff. Good stuff. Let's head to the East as the Raptors are done. They lose big. A game that was a 1-point game at the half, followed up by a 17-0 run on the other side, and it was jammed done against the Sixers, and James Harden actually showed up, which, hey, very strange scenario going on there. Very strange scenario going on with Joel Embiid's face as the Sixers move on to face the Heat. We know that Kyle Lowry is out for game 1. Jimmy Butler is listed as questionable, so a lot of injuries at the forefront of this series for sure. The other thing is game 1, Monday night, Heat favored by 7.5. I think the Sixers, to me, like already I was going to think this matchup was going to be shaky for the Sixers with a healthy Joel Embiid. Now add in the fact that, we're talking torn ligaments in his hand. Now he's a broken face. He's not even traveling for game 1.
Yeah.
Which is a really, really crazy thing too. He is out. He's not even traveling to Miami for games 1 and 2, which to me, I mean, this is just not looking good. Give me the Heat minus 7.5 in game 1 and Heat in 5 in this series, because Joel Embiid coming back to play games 3 and 4, maybe with a mask and a sore thumb. Like, I feel like he's coming out to get the Philly crowd fired up in his like Willis Reed moment, more so than actually like bringing some production to this game. And the Miami Heat are just sitting there ready for James Harden, like PJ Tucker, Bam, like whatever Morris twin it is, it's on their team. Like they got dudes that are just sitting there waiting for James Harden. And plus, we're talking James Harden in Miami.
Right.
You know how that goes. Yeah. Give me Heat in game 1, Heat in game 5, Heat in 5.
Yeah. So first and foremost, we got to pour one out for the Raptors, right? We had that nice little, I wish we could jump in the time machine to a time when it was tied at halftime, or there was a 1-point game at halftime. Unfortunately, the Raptors went and ruined NFL draft night with that third quarter. Who knew, right? Doc goes to his zone, making adjustments. He traps Pascal Siakam, right? The guy who's handling the ball at the top that we talked about, right? Like, okay, he's not that great of a ball handler. He's just good enough when one guy's on him, but trapping him, problematic, right? And one bad quarter and it all goes to hell in a handbasket. And so, maybe the big adjustment for the Sixers was they made shots in the first half, right? They scored 62 points in the first half. That might have been the only difference, really, when it comes down to the small sample size for all of that. So speaking of small sample size, right, Embiid breaks his face, but a couple of things. One, the market obviously adjusts for Embiid not being in the lineup, right? But we have to, unfortunately, this series is kind of ruined by all the uncertainty when it comes to injuries and that sort of thing. But at the same time, maybe it's not. Maybe there's some sort of value that we can glean from all of this. Mm-hmm. And so I look at this and I go, okay, 7.5, Miami minus 7.5. Where have I seen this before? And the answer is last week against the Atlanta Hawks. Mm-hmm. And so without Embiid, are the Embiid-less Sixers worse than the Hawks? Because once Kyle Lowry was out for that game, and again, I'm going to say that, Jimmy Butler is out for this game, even though we don't know. Is that where we're at with the Sixers team that still has, it's funny, we slag on James Harden, but I kind of like James Harden in an early early part of a series. And I kind of like him when he's the only guy who can beat you and plays that distributor role, right? And so the difference between James Harden now and James Harden before, it can't just be he's washed up. Right. It's a lot of it is role related. And so when you have to just give the ball to Joel Embiid or run plays for Joel Embiid, get him the ball basically every time that he's on the court. That's not really what James Harden does. James Harden he makes the best pass available, right? He spreads the ball out to the 3 or 4 guys. That's what we saw in Houston all those years, essentially. Right. And so without the focus on Embiid, I actually think James Harden's production is going to be pretty good. And especially if Jimmy Butler's out, and obviously Kyle Lowry would be a headache for James Harden potentially as well. You go, okay, well, who are the Heat going to switch or who are the Sixers going to switch Harden into, right? How are they going to run that? And the answer is I don't think it matters because this isn't Trae Young in his, third year trying to get big time shots off. This is James Harden. This is a better version right now. It's from a distribution. Wow. This is a better version right now from a distribution standpoint. And so I actually think James Harden's going to have a relatively decent series when Joel Embiid's out. Not to say that the Sixers are going to win the game, right? But that's not the requirement. The requirement is that this game specifically is close. Mm-hmm. And not even really all that close, 7.5, right? We saw the Hawks, whether they covered those, first 2 games, I believe in Miami or not, those games are 4 or 5 point games coming down the stretch. This isn't a Heat team that was pulling away from the Hawks, even when they were shutting down, by and large, Trae Young. Mm-hmm. And so I just look at it and I go yeah, the price is already built into Joel Embiid not being there. Is the price built into Jimmy Butler not being there? At 7.5, it certainly seems like it's priced into him playing. So right now, if you bet it right this second without knowing that Butler was going to play, I think you're getting some good value if he does play, because I don't think the line's going to go up much higher. And if he doesn't, I think it's got to drop down, because you'll recall that number was 4.5 in that closing game when Butler and Lowry were out. And so if you're going to tell me that the Sixers without Joel Embiid are just worse than the Atlanta Hawks, I'm just having a hard time believing that, right? And so I'm going to compare and contrast those 2 teams right now. And right now, 7.5 is basically as high as it ever got in that Hawks series. So I actually like the points here with the Heat, though I would never touch them with the Sixers, though I would never touch them to win the game outright or win the series. Mm-hmm. But honestly, if Jimmy Butler didn't play, would not shock me if they just got hot from outside. Harden was doing the Harden thing. And sometimes it takes a couple of games to get used to guarding James Harden, right? You almost need to experience how often that guy gets to the free throw line to sort of realize, man, we got to tie our hands behind our backs the way that the Raptors sort of figured out later on in the series. Now, I know the Heat are well coached, but you know what? So are the Raptors, and they still fouled a ton in those first couple of games. So yeah, I think this is going to turn out to be a little bit more of an over adjustment here with Miami minus 7.5. So I'll take the Sixers plus the points in game 1.
Yeah, it does suck really with all the injuries, because with the healthy team, if healthy both teams, this would actually be a way more fun series to root against the Sixers in. and that they would get blown out in this series against a healthy Miami Heat team. But yeah, I mean, everything comes down to James Harden right now, right? Like there's no excuses at all for him. And it's just, can you keep them in it? And the expectation should be for everyone involved that they shouldn't get blown out in these two games for sure. So I totally see where you're coming from in this series. Who knows if you end up seeing Joel Embiid, who knows if you end up seeing Kyle Lowry in this series, and Jimmy Butler. Yeah, I don't know. He's making memes on the sidelines. So we'll see how that goes for sure. And
Embiid can slap on a mask at some point, right? Like a lot of that is we see guys play with that.
That's what it is, right? Like
exactly. And to me, that's actually a safer sort of bet, so to speak, that he returns versus somebody with like a soft tissue injury, like Kyle Lowry with a hamstring or whatever, right? It's like, even Devin Booker, right? We talked about him, like, okay, that could go again at any given time. Embiid's not going to re-break his face, right? He's going to put the mask on, and if he's cleared to play, he's going to be good to go. But you're right. Yeah, the concussion protocol is the big issue there. And yeah, I mean, maybe if you're looking to bet this series, maybe you wait to see Miami win this game tonight, and then it tightens back this idea that, okay, by the way, Joel Embiid can fly down at any point to Miami to play for game 2, right? Just because he didn't travel yet doesn't mean that he won't travel down there for game 2. And then the other element is, like, obviously home court means a lot in the NBA, right? And losing 2 games in Miami isn't exactly a death knell either. Mm-hmm. And so as much as we sort of think, Philadelphia, the Sixers and Joel Embiid are sort of a loser type, built team here with Glenn Rivers, PhD, if we get to a point here with Miami winning this first game and we start talking ourselves, a plus 400, something along those lines for the Sixers on the series price, that's going to be pretty interesting. And I don't know if we're going to talk, between now and game 2 necessarily. So just sort of keep your head up and keep your eyes open for that, because I think after game 1, the Sixers series line might be an interesting play because this thing could end up being a longer series, especially if Embiid comes back.
Totally agree. Totally hear what you're saying there. The other series in the East, Milwaukee at Boston. Game 1 was Sunday as the Celtics just got beaten down by Giannis, who, of course, the NBA's favorite debate, who's the best player in the world, took another turn. Giannis with the 24, 13, and 12 triple-double, alley-oop into himself. I mean, I was on the Celtics, loud wrong in that one as they just got blown out. And it's funny when you're watching you're on a team like that, you're on the point spread, and you're just watching the game like, oh, this is an early loser. The funny thing, though, was that it was an early loser because of Drew Holiday, which is what brings me to game 2. Game 2, Celtics are favored by 4. And of course, there will be adjustments because we're talking about different coaches and stuff like that. And, I want to see what the adjustment is on Giannis, but also, like, will there be an adjustment on Giannis? Because he didn't really shoot that well. He just kind of like beast moded his way to a productive game, which is what Giannis does. So I'm interested to see what happens with Drew Holiday, who was the X factor for Milwaukee. He came out gunning and he had a really, really good game for them. I want to see, can he do that again? Right? Mm-hmm. Clearly you come out in game 1 and the focal point is, hey, there's no Chris Middleton. We need you to score. We need you to score. But we've seen the work before from Drew Holiday. And I love Drew Holiday. Defense is always going to be there. The scoring is going to be up and down. So for that reason, I'm going to be on the Celtics here at -4 in game 2. And then I'm going to just adjust accordingly and watch how the rest of this series plays out. I feel like I know what I'm going to get from Giannis. Mm-hmm. I just don't know what I'm going to get from the other guys. A blowout game 1 win. Cool. Merry Christmas. Happy for you, Milwaukee. But I want to see the next game in Boston and see how Boston adjusts before overreacting and thinking, oh, Boston's done. Milwaukee's going to roll them without Middleton. That's where I'm at in this series. Where are you at?
Yeah, and kudos to you for sort of being able to watch that game and then still come back and be like, yeah, I think Boston can right the ship here in game 2. And I'm not that I'm saying that I disagree, but like that is an exercise in handicapping that is, a mental strength, if you will, right? That you're going to have to be like, okay, this, that, or whatever, it wasn't as bad as it looked. Now we get into the shot quality numbers and the Bucks were, I think 57, something along like that, 57% to win the game based on the shot quality. And it should have been closer to like a 4 or 5 point game, but the Bucks still had full value on a win, because a lot of the times, right, you'll get a team pulling off an upset. And is it just shot making? Did they have the more difficult shots, but they made them, like that sort of thing? And the answer is no, like Milwaukee earned that. And so, yeah, the adjustments are going to have to come from the Celtics to actually get better shots. And that's always a little bit worrisome, right? Because sometimes the adjustment is keep getting the good shots and making the good shots. And sometimes the adjustment is get better shots. And if you can't get better shots, you're going to be in big trouble. And so, I look at it and, from a narrative standpoint, I go, okay, is it just a matter of the Celtics feeling really good about themselves after beating the Nets? And if you put the Nets, even if we don't think the Nets are that great, but if we, all season long, we put the Nets on this pedestal, and just because you and I, from a betting standpoint and evaluation standpoint, don't love the Nets, they still get regard, right? Kevin Durant gets regard within the league, right? Like that was a hurdle that the Celtics before the series and during the series, a lot of those games are really close. They had to feel like, oh yeah, like we can beat anybody if we can beat this team. And the answer, and the reality is like, no. Just because you beat the Nets does not mean you can beat anybody, because the Nets aren't that team that was put on this pedestal all season long. And so they take the couple of extra days off, right, because of the sweep. And then they come back and they just lay an absolute egg. Jaylen Brown just completely useless, basically, in that game. And it's funny how we talk about Kevin Durant, where coming into a series, and, you and I talked about the pricing for this series being like, Celtics minus 175. And like, I was just never really comfortable with that, right? We said, okay, let's wait a game. We grabbed, I talked about the under, and like the Celtics unders just keep sort of coming down from a high 220s against the Nets early on to the mid to low 220s against the Nets later on in that series to 218.5 at the start of this series. Now we're down at game 2 to 215, right? Like we've come all the way down with the Celtics, which is funny because we all know the Celtics have a really good defense, and it doesn't matter. They keep lining these games really, really high, but we're getting closer to a point where we can no longer bet these unders. But when we talk about Kevin Durant, we go, okay, like look out, he can do it. He can do it on his own, right? Because we've seen him do it on his own. Because when we think of Kevin Durant doing it on his own, it's shooting, right? Like he's making shots. And that's the thing that we gravitate to. We go, look at this guy, like getting buckets. He's getting buckets, like blah, 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 blah. We never talk about Giannis like that. Like we talk about him obviously with a regard for being a great player, but we never talk about like, oh, he can just win a game on his own, right? We always talk about like, oh, they need Middleton, they need Drew Holiday, because of obviously the evolution of this Bucks team not becoming a championship team until they got pieces around Giannis. But Giannis going, rebounding, defense, and the assists, right, for the triple doubles. Like that's the element too that like Kevin Durant isn't even providing. And so when you talk about like the debate about who's the best player in the world right now, like somehow the defending NBA and finals MVP who was putting up like 40 points per game in an NBA finals game, like we still don't give him enough regard that when we come into this series, he's plus, 150 to win the series. And we're like, I got to see a game. I got to watch a game first. It's like, how about we just bet on the best player in the world who affects the game in more than just getting buckets, right? How about we just wash away the idea of, okay, you're only good if you're making hard, difficult shots. How about making easy shots around the rim? How about affecting other teams' shots around the rim the way that Giannis does, right? How about rebounding, defense, and passing as well? And so I just look back at this and I go like, how did we miss this opportunity, right? We're trying to talk about like, okay, how do we get the Celtics here? Because Middleton's out. I'm like, I don't even really like Middleton all that much, right? So like, why am I not grabbing? This postseason is going to go down in history as me just kicking myself for not just taking some of these underdogs like the Mavericks and like the Bucks because of one player being out. Now, obviously, Luka Doncic is a significant player, but at the end of the day, like we talked about with Embiid, the market knows all of this, right? Like the market is aware that Chris Middleton is not out. How you value Chris Middleton's obviously a different situation. How you value Joel Embiid is a different situation. We talked about the valuation on Luka Doncic being like 9 points early on in the Utah Jazz series. And like, yeah, maybe I was harping on how crazy those point spreads were, but like, that's the stuff that we need to understand. We need to understand how many points these guys actually matter to the point spread. And so the reality is, whether it's the Heat closing out their series, against the Hawks without some of their top players, or all the guys that I just mentioned, right? Like, Chris Middleton just doesn't matter that much in a 1 game, 2 game, whatever sample size. Now we see the line go from 5, it's ticking from 4.5 to 5. It's down to 4 in this game. And here we are in the same situation that the Grizzlies are in, where the Celtics are going to need to win this game to avoid potentially getting swept. Now, I think they have a better chance of winning a road game than maybe Memphis does against the Warriors. That's not all that surprising, considering the Celtics are still favored in this game and the Grizzlies are underdogs at home in their game, right? So obviously there's a rating difference from this standpoint. So I don't disagree with you. All that is to say, I don't disagree with you because of the must-win nature of this game. I was disappointed in the home court on Sunday afternoon, right? Like, that was not the same atmosphere as it was against the Nets, the previous week. So yeah, I guess I'm back with you here on the Celtics -4. I guess I'm under 215, even though the number keeps dropping. But that was 189 points, something along those lines, right? We're not even remotely close to the total. And even the shot quality, I think, was like 101 to like 97, something along those lines, right? So we're still not even remotely close to a 215 total here. So I'm more likely to be back on the under than I am the Celtics, but at the Celtics -4, right? I certainly don't disagree with that, because we are in a must-win situation. You have to get more from Jaylen Brown. Luckily, Marcus Smart, they popped his shoulder back in, I guess. That was a scary moment for the Celts. This is a game that they have to have, and I think they're going to get it, though it has completely changed my point of view when it comes to this series, as far as believing in the Bucks and this idea that the Bucks, maybe they were overvalued at the start of the playoffs, but what from the Bucks outside of those first 2 games against Chicago has shown us that they are not absolutely ready to roll here and defend their title? The answer is nothing. So We'll see what happens.
Totally true. Super interesting. And I think this is where, it's a first real legit test for the Celtics D in terms of facing adversity, right? Like, they showed up and did well against Kevin Durant. So he didn't really have to make any more adjustments, because basically it worked. I guess they adjusted on Kyrie, or Kyrie just went Kyrie and didn't do much to end that series. But I'm interested to see what they come out and do in game 2. And to recap, because we tried to give out picks here for the next games in between the next time we talk. I'm on the Celts -4 in game 2 against Milwaukee, Heat -7.5 in game 1 versus Philly, Warriors -2 in game 2 in Memphis, and the Suns -5.5 in game 1 versus Dallas. Very interesting stuff for sure here on the pod as we continue to try to keep the roll going here of NBA picks. And Matt, really appreciate you coming on, but where can the people find you and what else you got going on? As I know it's going to get to be a busier time of the year.
Yeah, I basically went 0 dark 30 on Saturday, just absolutely wailing through Stanley Cup playoff preview, series by series, right? So you can catch those, all 8 of them, over at The Score. It's an app you've probably already got on your phone in the bet section over there. At Emrus Authentic, everything's getting retweeted, obviously, through there. Had a real fun time at the draft, or not at the draft, but watching the draft and tweeting through that. Once we get into hockey season, or Stanley Cup playoff season here, we're going to have some drama when it comes to overtimes and that sort of thing. And so add that into the NBA playoffs. I feel like sometimes people tweet and they talk about the game that they're watching, but they don't actually reference a player or a team. They're like, oh, I can't believe that shot. And it's like, we're going to need some clarification. We are definitely going to need some clarification over the next month or so on whether we're talking basketball or hockey, because they are both going to be in heavy rotation on the multi-screen system that I have over here. So I'm looking forward to it. Couldn't be more excited about it.
Sounds good, my dude. Thanks for stopping by. We'll catch up again down the line.
Thanks, pal.
And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Don't forget to like and subscribe to DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also rate us, review us, like us, all that other fun stuff. But for more from this new project from DRF Sports, just a little reminder. If you're unfamiliar with the letters DRF, it stands for Daily Racing Forum, which has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now we've taken over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, college sports, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has all of the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, team stats, and more. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want access to all of the raw data, drf.com/sports. That's where you can find the usual previews as we deep dive into the games. Of course, got you covered on this podcast. However you want your betting information, we've got you covered. Again, my name is Sheldon Alexander. That's all I got for now. But until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.